we can go ahead and get started with Symposium 4 on research. And we really have a great group up here to give a broad perspective on leadership, starting an academic career, but also the different pathways in creating an academic career. And I think in the context of maybe understanding the audience, I'd be interested to know who's early stage, maybe first 5 years of your practice? Okay. Who's beyond five years? Okay. Any med students, residents? Okay. So a nice mix. And I think this is really going to be tailored well to people that are sort of on that point where you're transitioning early into practice and next phases. And so maybe with that, without any further ado.
Next speaker is going to be Dr. Suzzane Tharin, who is a colleague of mine at Stanford, and she'll talk to you about funding opportunities for spine research.
Thank you for inviting me to talk about this very important topic. So let me begin. I have no disclosures of the lucrative kind, but I'd like to begin by disclosing the scope of the talk and the bias that I bring to it. So I'm an assistant professor at a university medical center. I'm also an early stage investigator with the NIH, currently navigating the K to R transition. I'm a neurosurgeon, so I know more about funds available for neurosurgeons than for orthopedic surgeons. And the research I carry out is fundamental research on development of the corticospinal circuit that controls walking. I'm also living and practicing in the United States. And so that bias is going to be reflected in the content of the talk, but what I'd really like to do is to share with you some hopefully reasonably well-organized pearls that I wish someone had shared with me 9-ish years ago when I started out, so that I wouldn't have had to maybe learn them through bumps. So one useful way to categorize funding opportunities is first by source and then distinctly by mechanism. So the major funding sources are internal university awards, foundation awards like the CSRS or OREF, or some of the spinal cord injury foundations, federal awards such as those offered by the National Institutes of Health or Veterans Affairs, industry awards, which I know nothing about and I've never had one, and what I like to call hidden funding, which is a reminder to me to encourage you to look for money in places where you didn't think it existed. Within each of these mechanisms, there are often multiple award types, and I've listed these roughly in ascending order of seniority of the grantee, right? So mentored research awards, I'm super stoked that you talked about K awards, because I'm going to talk about them too. Young investigator awards, independent awards, this is like the R series. Pilot grants and bridge funds, which really are for everybody at all stages of their academic careers. And cooperative agreements, these are the U-type awards, big multi-center trials. I've never held one of those, so I'm not going to talk about those either. So I'd actually like to spend the bulk of my talk talking about NIH awards because they're a very important and large source of funding for science here. And also because spine surgeons are so woefully underrepresented among NIH-funded investigators, and I would love, love, love for that to change. We're not only underrepresented among physician scientists who are funded by the NIH, we're even, for instance, woefully underrepresented among neurosurgeon scientists who are funded by the NIH. A paper came out in 2020 suggesting that spine surgeons constituted 6% of NIH-funded neurosurgeons. And yet, in the world of neurosurgery, spine is a huge chunk, and we have so many important questions that are so critical to public health, curing paralysis, addressing back pain. We should be in there in numbers. And so I really want to encourage everyone to consider this. So within the world of the NIH, I want to talk about mentored awards, not very much about our series awards, and then I want to kind of direct you to little pots of gold within the NIH website. Funding opportunity announcements, NIH Reporter, which is like Google for NIH grants, the Early Career Reviewer Program, which I think all of you should try to participate in, all of you who don't yet have an R01. Early stage investigator status, very, very important in terms of improved pay lines, and getting to know your program officer. So mentored awards are a great way to get into the NIH's pipeline and into the physician scientist pipeline, as Mike already mentioned. So these are the K08, K23. The NRCDP is a neurosurgery program that's very similar to the other Ks, and the K99, which is kind of like a half K08, half R01. For the Ks, with the exception of the back half of the K99, these are mostly salary awards. And the thought process behind it on the NIH's part is that the salary support provides muscle from the NIH to protect your protected time. I interviewed for one job where the chairman told me that I could do all of my research between midnight and 3 in the morning. And I'm just not smart enough to do good science and good grant writing between midnight and 3 in the morning only when I've been in the OR all day. I just don't, So you do need protected time, and this is, I think, a theme that's coming across from all of the speakers. So a K is a great way to get it, and I have seen others, smart negotiators, actually leverage that salary component of the K08 to negotiate salary support for a technician, salary support for a faculty member to cover call during what is intended to be protected time, or negotiate with their mentors kind of no-cost extension on all the bench costs so that you can sit on like a low six-figure pot of bench costs at the very end of the K. So there's a lot you can negotiate with the K, good that comes beyond the award itself. It gets you into the system. You get to know at least one program officer. You get to know a program director. So in the case of the Institute for Neurologic Diseases and Stroke, that would be Steve Korn. He runs all the K programs and the NRCDP. You get to know through a series of special meetings your peers, other spine surgeon or neurosurgeon or orthopedic surgeon scientists who are funded by these career development awards. And it gets you into the pipeline to become an early career reviewer, which is a phenomenal program. Former K awardees also have higher success rates when they apply for R01s. Career development plans are actually a required part of a K application. And so again, I think that the process forces you to do this very important thing. So the R series, these are the independent investigator awards. The main point I want to make about Rs is that there's an award called an R21, and a lot of people suffer under the misconception that it's the bridge it's the bridge grant between a K award and an R01. And it's really not, and people are further tempted to sink a lot of effort into it because there's supposedly no preliminary data required. But you can seriously get knocked on your reviews for feasibility. So it's not, and it's almost as much work as applying for an R01, but it's only 2 years of funding. So it's all the same work, half as much funding. It has its purposes, but it's not designed specifically for junior investigators. So, funding opportunity announcements. That's a URL, and I will make all of these available. I think my slides are going to be available, and I will post many of these links on Twitter following my talk. There's a lot more out there in the world of NIH funding than just the parent announcements. And if you go to the research opportunity announcement page of your institute, you can browse, you can search by keyword. A lot of these opportunities have more favorable pay lines, set aside funds. They're not reviewed by the usual study section mechanism. They may be reviewed directly by the institute. And this is really the institutes at the NIH telling you what they want to fund in the next few years. I've seen this work for a number of new investigators, and I'm super stoked to say, as of this morning, I'm going to include myself in the group. Now, I'm only a co-investigator on this grant, but the principal investigator and I have both submitted R01s under the parent mechanism, and neither one of us have ever gotten as high of a score as what we got on this one. It's really cool research, by the way. It's like small non-coding RNAs determining if poison frogs are going to be aggressive or social, depending on what they experience as tadpoles. But anyways, Look for special announcements. NIH Reporter is like the Google of NIH grants. And the reason this is a valuable site is because it's a good way when you're starting out to find a study section. So when you apply for a grant, you've got to kind of suggest who's going to be your reviewers. And this is a good way to kind of get a feel for where successful grants that look a little bit like yours get reviewed. Also a good way to find a program officer. That's your advocate. That's your parent in the NIH once you get funded. And if you're nosy, it's also just a good way to look up other people's funding. The Early Career Reviewer Program is something I would encourage all of you who are ranked at assistant professor or lower and don't have R01 funding yet to pursue. So you basically get a reduced load of grants to review, but you get to be part of study sections. So they give you 2 or 3 grants, whereas most people get 5 or 6. And you sit in on study section. You get an inside view of exactly what reviewers are looking for. And depending on which study section it is, you may get some phenomenal mentorship from the scientific review officer who runs it. So that's the URL. There's some particular qualifications. Basically, the second RPNS paper came out, I had my first senior author publication out of my lab. That day, I applied for this program because it's really valuable. And I've kind of done my stint, and I learned a ton. Early stage investigator. This is anybody who's within 10 years of finishing their fellowship or their last degree. This is important because you have a different pay line, so your percentile score that's likely to get funded is higher. So you don't have to have as competitive a grant in order to get funded as an ESI. You're also discussed separately at study section. And so you want to make sure, and this is like I'm telling you this because I did it wrong, that you've entered your fellowship training, that you have the right terminal degree, and that you are correctly listed as an early stage investigator. You can also get extensions of your ESI status for things like having a kid or the impact of COVID on your research. And so very important to know about that. Your program officer is kind of like your parent at the NIH. Once you are funded, that's the person who's kind of in charge of you and your work. Before you're funded, you can figure out who your program officer is likely to be and send them your aims. You should really, 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 really do this. And you must never, 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 never do this right before the deadline for submission. You should also let them know when your grant is going to be discussed by the reviewers because they'll listen in. And then they'll interpret the reviewer comments for you because, especially for beginners, there's a lot of reading between the lines. And listen to their advice. I have at least one friend who was going to abandon an R01 after 2 submissions, and his PO told him, you absolutely must submit this. I want this in my portfolio. He resubmitted, he resubmitted, and it was funded. I'm going way over time, but there are mid-career awards that are interesting. This slide is really only valuable for the URL and for a flavor if you're kind of at the associate or full professor level. The NIH will fund you to expand your research career. Okay, so in summary for this, get to know your program officer, check your ESI status, become an early career reviewer. I cannot emphasize that strongly enough. Get in the pipeline, look for special RFAs, Google grants in NIH Reporter, and most of all, don't give up. Like, really keep trying. There are a number of other federal awards. A lot of them represent parallel universes to the NIH, and so all of this stuff I told you about applying for NIH grants applies the same for things like the AHRQ. With regard to foundations, I would say, in the language of the SAT, elevator pitch is to philanthropy support. What specific aims are to an NIH grant. So you want to hone your elevator pitch when you talk to grateful patients or representatives of philanthropic organizations. Hidden fundings. I talked about special calls for applications from the NIH. Another great source of hidden funding are these post-bac programs for students. In California, we have quite a few for students from disadvantaged backgrounds, underrepresented minorities, or the community college system who are looking to transition into a research career. And this will get you a paid research assistant for 1 to 2 years with some bench costs as well. So those are programs worth looking into. This comforts me all the time. I tell myself this over and over again. I think I'd like to reiterate the idea that you need to protect your protected time. Have sacrosanct writing time, which is actually different from sacrosanct academic time. It's just writing, and it's just academic writing. It's not writing emails. The difference between writers and not is writers write when they don't feel like it. I think running or any form of sports is actually essential to helping you make that transition from a long case in the OR to sitting down and writing. Avail yourself of all available grant writing resources, solicit highly critical feedback, and remember, writing is rewriting. Also remember, so this is the one way that I'm super successful, success is the ability to go from failure to failure without losing your enthusiasm. I'm going way over, so just to say that it is about 10 to 1, or even maybe slightly worse, the application to rejection ratio, or application to success ratio. So don't be discouraged. Protect your time, develop a writing habit, and don't give up. There's nothing really to say about this except I wanted to make these web pages available to everyone, as well as these grant writing resources. And in addition to acknowledging the support I've received, so this is past and current, and here are all of my rejections. Many of them are from the same places. So don't give up. And this is my Twitter handle. I'm going to try and post all of these URLs before the end of the day. Thank you so much.